And welcome to all of you. I am so glad to be the host of this webinar, and you're also welcome on behalf of the IED expert team from SDC headquarters in Bern. We're also excited that you took the time today to learn and discuss with us the link and connectivity of PSE and VSD. So both topics, as I'm sure all of you know, are very relevant, and Switzerland has considerable expertise and experience in both of them. And also looking at in light of the new cooperation strategy, both topical areas are of importance. In vocational education and training, it has long been a cornerstone of Swiss development cooperation and is considered key for creating professional opportunities in partner countries. Looking at private sector engagement, it is absolutely essential that Switzerland joins forces with all relevant stakeholders, including the private sector, to attain the SDGs and to achieve shared development impacts. So intuitively, when thinking about the two topics, there are a lot of touch points and a lot of overlaps where we see considerable potential. So we're excited and want to explore in depth with you today why and how this could be impactful, relevant, and interesting for SDC. So looking at the webinar, what we would like to do with you today is to consider how the private sector is involved in SDC VSD projects, how cooperation with the private sector is structured, and what lessons can be learned from these experiences. We also hope to provide practical advice and guidance, so we're collecting your expectations right here, right now. And we also want to thank everyone who has contributed to this slide deck, because it really is an incredible resource of information that we hope you will also take into your daily working lives. Beyond the webinar, we really consider this a living document, a living exchange where we want to learn and share about PSE and VSD. We're very happy to consider all of your expectations, and also beyond this webinar organize online exchanges or webinars on this topic overall, or also kind of detailed aspects that are of relevance to you. So we really hope today to give you a glimpse of what could be an engagement of PSE in VSD, and also hope that you're curious and excited to dive deeper with us, and all of your expectations that you have in the future, we're very happy to take on and to be on this journey with you. So without further ado, I hand back and over to the content creators, and I wish you all a great webinar. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Lynn. Let's directly start with first the conceptual framework for private sector engagement in skills development. And just for your information, as I said before, all the slides that we show here, they're taken from this slide deck that also Lynn mentioned, and that Hans and myself developed during the last almost 9 months, together with a large number of resource persons from project implementers as well as from the SDC. So Hans, let's start with a very simple question. What is PSE, and how far is it different from VSD and PSD and FSD?
Yeah, that's a lot of abbreviations, Roman, but thank you.
That is.
Let's see. Private sector engagement. I think what we're trying to do today is also to demystify a little bit private sector engagement. So if you talk about private sector engagement, it basically refers to engaging the private sector, which is basically engaging a company to do something with you. And that something is often a constraint in a sector that you've seen, where you think like this is a problem that should be addressed. There are companies, they should have an interest in solving that problem, and let me try to engage them and solve that problem together. To make it a bit more concrete, you could imagine that within the IT sector, there are challenges. Companies have difficulties recruiting employees because they don't have the right skill sets. If you analyze the vet schools, you find out that they're training the wrong skill sets. So then there we see two things. One is the schools are training the wrong skill sets to students. Companies face a problem finding the right employees. So then you could say, let me engage with an IT company and see if we can do something together. And that something together could be that you say, all right, can I engage you, IT company, or a number of IT companies, to develop together with us training content for the vet schools to deliver better skills training. If you do that, that normally works out into a partnership. So SDC creates a partnership with a IT company, and together they analyze what's the problem, how can we address the problem, what could we do, who funds what, we fund together, we manage together, we implement together, and we are responsible together. So that is basically private sector engagement. So it's often a partnership between SDC and a company. And how far is it different from VSD? Well, VSD is more like a thematic cluster, just like PSD, private sector development or financial services development. It's what we call a thematic cluster. And within that cluster, whether it's VSD or PSD or FSD, you could have a partnership with a company, and that we would call private sector engagement. So private sector engagement is more like a modality, a way of working, rather than something else besides VSD or PSD. So it's broader.
Great. Thanks, Hans. Before asking my second question, just calling all of you, please, if you have questions, post them into the chat so that we can continuously trying to address them. Hans, what are the different levels of partnerships that we identified during our research?
Yeah, we were struggling a lot, and we came to sort of 3 types of partnerships. Like I said, we're trying to demystify PSE a little bit. So you're going to see 3 graphs or 3 levels of partnerships. And then once we discuss them, then we can say, okay, does this qualify as PSE or is this something else? Now, if you look at the first graph, you see the real world, as I like to call it. You see the vocational skills system with all the vet schools and all the other actors there, and you see the private sector. And in most countries, in most systems, they would interact with each other. So that would be partnerships between them, between vet schools and companies, for example. And they need that because they need to work things together out. You could imagine that vet schools, they need information about labor markets. Vet schools need apprentices. So basically what you see is that either it's there already or it would be the result of your program interventions, that there are relationships between vet schools and companies, which basically means they are in agreement. There's a transaction between them. Vet schools help companies to organize the placements. Companies actually do the placements. Maybe the schools, they coach the mentors. So that relationship is there forever. It's a sustainable one. It's the one you want to leave behind when you withdraw from the sector. It also means that in those partnerships, SDC is not involved. VSD programs are not involved. So they're not engaging the private sector. So in this sense, it's a relationship between the vet system and the private sector, and we call that a partnership, which is crucial, but it's not private sector engagement. If we would go to the next slide, then you would see there are different types of partnerships. Here we talk about VSD programs, which are existing. So the VSD programs, they have a strategy, they have intervention areas, they have interventions, activities. Now let's say the same example you had before. There's a problem in IT. In this sense, the existing VSD program, which is then often implemented by an NGO, by an SDC implementer, they might say, wait a minute, we see this problem in the IT sector, we need to do something with an IT company. So basically, they discuss with an IT company, what can you do? Do you see it's a problem? Can we help you solve that problem? Could you maybe even set up a training center so that you train youth? So the program and the IT company, they discuss, agree, analyze, design, fund together that training center. Now this is what we call delegated private sector engagement. And why do we call it delegated private sector engagement? Because it's not SDC, but it's an SDC funded program implementer who actually engages the private sector. So it's still private sector engagement. It's still a partnership. It's a temporary partnership because it's basically temporary because it's a VSD program supporting an IT company to make a change in the vocational skills sector. But because it's not SDC owned, but delegated to an implementer, we call it delegated private sector engagement. And I expect lots of questions from you later. The difference with this one, where we talk about SDC partnering, is that in the previous one, we have a program which is designed and has different ways of working. And one of them could be forming partnerships. So one of the interventions could be a partnership with the company. In graph 3, we talk about a different type of partnership. We talk about SDC partnering with a company directly. And that could be, again, the same structured in an IT company. But the difference here is that SDC partners with the company to make that specific change. And together with the company, they design. So there's nothing at the moment. And together they say, there is a problem. I realize this is a problem. You realize it's a problem. We both want to solve the problem. So let's create a program, an intervention that we together are going to design, we're going to fund, we're going to implement. And that will lead to a specific change. And that could be the same setup. IT companies that are going to provide vet schools with information about how to change the way people are being trained, so that the end result will be that the vet schools have a different way of training youth so that they find faster employment with the IT companies. And the IT companies are interested because they are able to grow in the IT sector, because one of their crucial challenges is finding the right employees. So the difference between this private sector engagement and the previous one is basically who is doing it. So if you talk about SDC partnering with the company, we call that private sector engagement. If it's a VSD program partnering with a company, we call it delegated PSE. If it's a vet school partnering with a company, we call that a partnership. And often you see that that first one is the result of the other ones. I hope this is sort of clear, but I'm expecting a lot of questions actually.
Thanks, Hans. I think the presentation was very clear. Do we have any questions of understanding at this moment regarding these 3 levels of partnerships? I can't see any in the chat.
Roman, you don't have questions on what has been presented yet. We have some expectations that have been shared, but no questions yet.
Great, thank you, Franz. So let's move on to our, let's say, second topic that we would like to discuss, not only with Hans, but also with Marloes. It's about incentives. What are key incentives and also disincentives for the private sector and from the private sector, and how to find win-win solutions. So please, if you have any questions regarding these inputs, but also the previous ones, use the chat, and there will be another slot for questions coming up soon. When we talk about incentives, Hans, what are the main incentives for private sector partners to engage, or for companies to engage in skills development? And what is the role of SDC in that context?
Yeah, I think the role of SDC in this context is to find out what are the real incentives, which is, it's a bit weird. But I do think that we're so often assuming that the companies have a certain incentive, and I think it's $1 million question that we're not answering a lot. Incentives basically means that companies should benefit, and that benefit should relate to the cost and the risk that they're taking. Which basically means that only if a sector constraint is resolved and it directly benefits the company is when I would say that a company has an interest, an incentive to actually partner to solve that problem. Partnering with SSC means access to funds, means access to network, means access to technical expertise. But the main problem is always how to benefit. Do companies benefit from such kind of program, such kind of private sector engagement? And there are sort of two dimensions to really dive deep into. The first one is the short-term versus long-term aspect, the time dimension. As you can imagine from a business perspective, if I would be a business and they say you need to invest a lot of money and it's quite risky this year, and you might be benefiting in 10 years, I'm going to scratch my back. The question is a little bit, can you sort of make the benefits more upfront so that companies really benefit from their investment? And that's tricky. The second thing is that there's a benefit for the company that you're working with, but there's often a benefit for the sector. So if there's a constraint in a sector and you can address it with one company, that's fine. It's their cost, it's their risk, and it's their benefit. But often you would see it's a challenge in a sector which nobody can really solve on their own. And if it is being addressed, take the example of IT where you get much better employees, potential employees, then every IT company benefits. So a lot of companies would say, I'm a bit hesitant to invest into developing an IT center, an IT training center, because it will not only be me who's benefiting from the cost that I made, but it's also my competitors which are going to benefit. And then you get a challenge like, why should I do that? Because I invest and my competitors benefit. So this is often the biggest challenge, to find out that incentive, and there's no blue book. So I think the only way you can do is be a bit skeptical. A lot of companies would say that, I think what is crucial is that you try to find out from the companies what they think is a reasonable benefit and what they think is a reasonable cost. And when we talk about benefit, it's not only about money. It's not only that their profit goes up. It's not only that their turnover increases or their market share increases. I think a lot of times we talk about productivity, we talk about the power to innovate, we talk about their reputation as a champion in the sector. It's about being a responsible employer. So a lot of those kind of benefits are important, but I think when you get down to the business model, the business case, I think it's important to find out what is the true incentive for them. I think in relation to that's enough, Rowan?
That's enough, Hans. That was very good. But let's look at it in the context of a practical example. And there I would like to hand over to Marloes. As the OYA project, your project, is quite particular, as it is a partnership between SDC and the MasterCard Foundation. And within the project, there are a number of delegated PSEs with local companies. What have been the main incentives for them to join? And what did you as a project or as SDC bring to the partnership?
All right. Thank you very much, Roman. I was actually thinking before moving to this question, I could perhaps use 2 minutes to introduce the project a bit, because otherwise people might get lost. So perhaps you could go to the next, this slide indeed. Thank you very much. So the field experience or the practical experience comes from the Opportunities for Youth Employment project. This project was funded by the MasterCard Foundation, and later the Embassy of Switzerland joined as a co-funder. The first phase has already ended of the project, and the second phase, at least in Tanzania, is about to start. The main goal of the program was really youth improving their livelihoods through gainful employment / self-employment. And the target of the program was young women and men aged 18 between 30, living in rural areas and who are out of school. In reality, this meant that most of them, they finished primary education and either never started with secondary education or they dropped out at some point in time. The countries where the implementation, the project was implemented first was Rwanda, Mozambique, and Tanzania. And currently the project is implemented in about 9 countries in sub-Saharan Africa by the implementing partner SNV. The general approach of the project was around provision of technical and soft skills, on-the-job training. I have to mention, though, it's more like sort of like an informal apprenticeship kind of training, exposure to the world of work via exhibitions and field visits, grouping youth into saving and credit schemes so they had access to finance, and coaching them towards self-employment and setting up a business. And yeah, the project started really with conducting a market scan in the areas, it's rural areas as I mentioned, to look at what are the booming businesses in that area and what booming businesses or market opportunities are also attractive for the youth, because this is not always in sync, of course. And what they found out is that especially in the renewable energy sector, and mainly the solar sector, and some of the agricultural sectors and processing sectors were growing and expanding to those areas. And the company's main incentive to have at least an interest in the program was because they were in need of human resource. They were in need they wanted to expand their business, so markets, so they needed human resource to either support them as retailers, agents, technicians. They also needed sometimes people who are joining the factories for processing, and of course produce, so vegetables mainly. Well, the incentive that the program or the project provided was first of all sort of like a financial incentive for companies that were willing to provide on-the-job training to this target group, whereby the apprenticeship was initially 14 days, and the incentive worked in a way that young people who were sort of perceived as less attractive by the company, like lower skilled or because of their gender, would get a higher incentive than youth, than if they would engage youth who were perceived as more attractive, usually male youth with a higher level of education. And after the on-the-job training, if they would retain the youth for at least 3 months, they would get another incentive. And we perceived, or we felt that especially the solar industry, the solar companies, a lot of them are in these social enterprises, they really, really appreciated this approach. And I can say so because they invested themselves also a lot in the youth beyond the expected soft skills training and technical training that we had expected or agreed with them. They provided the young people with kits, with equipment, with gadgets such as T-shirts, etc. And towards the end, I think over 600 youth have been employed by one particular company, Mobisol. For the companies working in the agricultural sector, we also felt that they really appreciated this sort of like engagement, and they also took up a lot of youth for on-the-job training because of the need. But what we saw there, especially in the companies that were involved in the meat processing sector, slaughterhouses, poultry farms, etc., is that after a while, usually after like 3 to 6 months, youth would leave the company and start their own business in the same occupation. So so it was more difficult with the agricultural sectors to really have the business case and to really engage them for a longer period of time.